Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, the Prince of Wales was introduced to Wallis Simpson by his latest mistress. This led to all sorts of emotions from the Prince of Wales and from the palace. King George V had a bad feeling about his son. He had the intuition to see that he would never be a good king, or a king at all. By the end of the video, the prince decided to step away from being a king, so let's see what develops next. The king told his younger brother what his plans were, and the Duke was shocked and went home to tell his wife. The Duchess then decided to write a letter to the Queen. "My darling Mama, Bertie has just told me what has happened, and I feel quite overcome with horror and emotion. My first thought was of you, and your note, just arrived as I was starting to write to you, was very helpful. One feels so helpless against such obstinacy. God help us all to be calm and wise. Your devoted daughter-in-law, Elizabeth." The next morning, Wednesday, November 18th, the Duke and Duchess went to see Queen Mary to discuss the crisis. It was still unknown to only a very close circle. And on November 20th, the Yorks went to stay for a shooting weekend with the Pembrokes at Wilton House. They couldn't talk about what was going on, so that must have had them preoccupied, and it had to be difficult to be around people. When the Duchess wrote the Queen, she said, "It seems almost incredible that David contemplates such a step, and every day I pray to God that he will see reason and not abandon his people. I am sure that it would be a great shock to everybody, and a horrible position for us naturally." The Duchess ended by saying, "I do not know what we should do without you, darling Mama." The family found it impossible to reach the king. It was distressing, of course, to the Duke of York. He wrote to his brother on November 23rd saying, "I do so long for you to be happy with the one person you adore," and adding, "I feel sure that whatever you decide to do will be in the best interest of this country and empire." The Duchess on the same day wrote to the king too. It was a plea on the behalf of her unhappy, bewildered husband. "Darling David, please read this. Please be kind to Bertie when you see him, because he loves you and minds terribly all that happens to you. I wish that you could realize how loyal and true he is to you, and you have no idea how hard it's been for him lately. I know that he's fonder of you than anybody else, and as his wife I must write and tell you this. I am terrified for him, so do help him. And for God's sake, don't tell him that I have written. We both uphold you always, E." Across the top of the page she wrote, "We want you to be happy, more than anything else, but it's awfully difficult for Bertie to say what he thinks. You know how shy he is, so do help him." The king went to Wales to tour the mining villages of South Wales, and he sympathized with the destitute, unemployed miners. He felt strongly about the plight of the unemployed, and because he was so popular, he started to feel he might be able to stay on as king. The end of November, he was requesting a morganatic marriage in which his wife wouldn't become queen, but would hold some lesser title. The Prime Minister didn't think much of this solution. He didn't think the Dominion or the public would accept it either, and liberal parties agreed with the Prime Minister. November 28th, Baldwin sent telegrams out to the Dominions, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and the Irish Free State to seek their views on the marriage. They didn't accept the idea of a morganatic marriage, let alone the notion that Mrs. Simpson might become queen. By December, the news had hit the newspapers. The king decided to send Mrs. Simpson abroad, away from the public drama and private turmoil. She was receiving poison pen letters, and then somebody threw a brick through the window of her rented house, so she stayed at Fort Belvedere. She left on December 3rd for the villa of Mr. and Mrs. Herman Rogers in Cannes. She was accompanied by a friend, Lord Brownlow, and she took £100,000 worth of jewelry. She walked out of Belvedere without saying goodbye to any of the staff. The king cried when he said goodbye to her and begged her to call him when she stopped for the night. Later, Simpson said that he told her, "You must wait for me, no matter how long it takes. I shall never give you up." It took just 8 more days for him to give up everything else. When Mrs. Simpson left, the king went to Marlborough House and saw Queen Mary, the Duke of York, and Princess Mary. He told them that he could not live alone as king, and that he must marry Mrs. Simpson. When Mrs. Simpson read the papers, she was horrified by the often critical tone of the papers. It was the first time that a monarch had been so roundly attacked since Queen Victoria had been criticized for shutting herself away after Prince Albert's death. When the people got the news in Britain, it affected them. The Duchess's childhood friend, Freddie Dalrymple Hamilton, stated, "Apparently he wishes to marry an American lady called Mrs. Simpson, who it is said has already been twice divorced in America. Heaven knows one wishes H.M. nothing but happiness, but such a marriage would be so repugnant to the British people generally that it can never be approved by any cabinet. It seems incredible that H.M., with all his consideration and sympathy for others, should really contemplate abandoning the ship in the middle of the storm, especially as he is the most popular man in the British Empire. The public opinion was divided among those who felt that the king should not marry her, and then those who said that the king should be allowed to marry the woman he loved. By the weekend of December 5th and 6th, the support that the king had seemed to have evaporated as the enormity of what he wished to do sank into the minds of the British people. Any thoughts of a king's party was over. The Duke wrote his mother that he had talked to David, and he seemed calm, and he wasn't going to be hurried in his decision. The Duke wrote to his mother that he felt sad for her, and that he could imagine what she must be going through, and what anxiety that she had gone through in the last 3 weeks. The Duke said he was feeling overwrought about what was going to befall him, but with her help he knew he would be able to carry on. And then he said, "I really cannot believe that David is going." On December the 6th, the Prime Minister Baldwin went to see Queen Mary at Marlborough House. He was nervous because of her shyness, and it was kind of difficult to overcome. But she greeted him with the words, "Well, a pretty kettle of fish we're in now." She thought the idea of a morganatic marriage was the worst solution of all, and she couldn't support it. She thought it would create a court within a court, and to make her position intolerable. She didn't think she should compete with Mrs. Simpson. The king refused to see his brother over the weekend. He stated he had yet to make up his mind what to do. And the Duke and the Duchess waited anxiously just down the road at Royal Lodge. The king was still trying to have his way. Mrs. Simpson was in an uncomfortable villa in the south of France, and she offered advice and threats by the telephone. These calls were painful for the king, and the people could hear him shouting at the phone, and sometimes he was in tears. It was said that those who heard his end of the calls would never forget them. Mrs. Simpson was urging him to be strong and rely on his personal popularity and tough out the government and insist on his rights. On December the 6th, she issued a statement declaring herself ready to withdraw from the situation, but she knew the king wouldn't give her up, and she wanted him to keep the throne. She felt that after a decent amount of time, the king would win the popular support. December the 7th, the king finally agreed to see the Duke of York at Fort Belvedere. It was 7 p.m., and the Duke was pacing up and down the room, and the king told his brother that he had decided to abdicate. The Duke was going to stay with his brother and help him in his hour of need, and around this time the Duchess had a flu attack. It seemed like she would get these attacks whenever she got stressed out about something. I guess her resistance was low, and that caused it to happen. She was absent for most of the dramatic events that followed, and she was stunned by it all, just like her husband. She couldn't believe what was happening. Her position on Mrs. Simpson being a morganatic wife is that if she is not fit to be queen, she's not fit to be the king's morganatic wife. December 9th, the Duke returned to London to his mother and wife, and he went to see Queen Mary, and at this time Walter Monckton came, bringing the draft of the instrument of abdication to show them. The Duke recorded that I broke down and sobbed like a child. His mother remembered it later, saying he was appalled. He was devoted to his brother, and the whole abdication crisis made him miserable. He sobbed on my shoulder for an hour there upon the sofa, and Queen Mary was in shock. In her diary, she wrote with exclamation marks, something that she never did. She still could not believe that her son, her firstborn, was determined to abdicate the throne of the empire because he wishes to marry Mrs. Simpson, with 4 exclamation marks. The whole affair has lasted since November 16th, and it's been very painful. It's a terrible blow to us all, and particularly to poor Bertie. December 10th at 10 a.m. in the presence of his brothers, the king signed the instrument of abdication, which declared his irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for myself and for my descendants. A few hours later, the Prime Minister told the whole story to the House of Commons and then to the world. That day, negotiations became unpleasant on the subject of the financial settlement to be agreed on with the king after his abdication. The most difficult questions involved Sandringham and Balmoral. The king's will had granted his son a life interest. The properties now had to be passed on to the Duke of York, but the king wanted a generous settlement for himself, as much as he could get. He stated that his total fortune was only £90,000, and that he couldn't survive without subsidy. He insisted that his brother should buy his interest in Sandringham and Balmoral. The Duke agreed to pay him $25,000 a year if the government declined to do so. Later, though, everybody found out that the king had lied to his brother about his true finances. His wealth was really £1 million instead of £100,000. It was a suicidal lie, according to King Edward VIII's biographer. It drove further pain into the brothers' relationship over the years to come, and what a sneaky thing that he tried to do. When the Duke returned to his home that night at 145 Piccadilly, he later recorded, "I found a large crowd outside my house cheering wildly. I was overwhelmed." December the 11th, the king's abdication was announced just before 2 p.m. The Duke was now King George VI, and he decided to take his father's name to strengthen the sense of continuity. The new king felt it was that dreadful day. He was occupied with the arrangements for his Ascension Council and proclamation, and with the difficult question of what his brother's title should be now. The decision had to be made quickly because his brother insisted on making a farewell broadcast, and Sir John Reith of the BBC was planning to introduce him on the air that night as Mr. Edward Windsor. The king pointed out that that was quite wrong and instructed that his brother should be introduced as His Royal Highness Prince Edward. He declared that his intention of giving the ex-king a new title, and his first act of his reign was to make his brother Duke of Windsor. That evening at Royal Lodge was the last time the royal family dined there. The new queen wasn't there. She was still sick, and she wrote to her brother-in-law, "Darling David, I'm so miserable that I cannot come down to Royal Lodge owing to being ill in bed, as I wanted so much to see you before you go and say God bless you from my heart. We are all overcome with misery and can only pray that you will find happiness in your new life. I often think of the old days and how much you helped Bertie and I in the first years of our marriage. I shall always mention you in my prayers and bless you, Elizabeth." After dinner, Prince Edward was driven to Windsor Castle to make his farewell broadcast. He wrote the speech himself, with some help from both Monckton and Churchill. He spoke well and moved many of his listeners to tears. He declared his allegiance to the new monarch and his loyalty to Britain. He felt it was impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king as he would wish to do without the help and the support of the woman he loved. He entrusted the nation to his brother, and he ended the speech stating, "We now all have a new king. I wish him and you and his people happiness, prosperity, with all my heart. God save the king." The Duke returned to the Royal Lodge to say goodbye to his family. Queen Mary had been relieved by the content of her son's speech. It was a low point in her life, but she displayed dignity and courage. Then Queen Mary said it was time for the dreadful goodbye, and he was leaving that evening for Austria. The new king embraced his predecessor, and the Duke bowed to his new sovereign. King George VI returned to London and to his sick wife, who by her later account had lived the last week in a daze. Many years later, Queen Elizabeth stated that we all loved the Prince of Wales, and we all thought he was going to be a wonderful king. When he decided to go, it was a shock to his brother, because they were great friends. She said it was fortunate that he was never crowned, and that that was one of the good things that he did. If he was going to make his mind up to go anyway, to do it before. She said, "I don't think he ever wanted to be king. I don't think he thought of it as something he ought to do. Very odd. He had extraordinary charm, and then it all disappeared. I don't know what happened. Nobody knows, really. He was frightfully popular. Everybody adored him. I think he may have thought he was so popular that people would want him back. Whatever. I imagine that it might have been in his mind. He was immensely popular all over the Commonwealth. He was extremely attractive, and that makes it all the more strange, the whole thing. He must have been bemused with love, I suppose. You couldn't reason with him. Nobody could. The whole government tried. Everybody tried. The only good thing is, I think, he was quite happy with her." So I'm going to stop the video here. In this episode, we have the king not willing to give up the woman he loved. He tried different ways to have her join him, even without her becoming queen, but that wasn't going to happen. Members of the court didn't agree, nor did the United Kingdom and its dominions. The family was in shock throughout the process. The Duke was shady about his money affairs, trying to get even more money, but his lies were found out. Then it came time to say goodbye, and his brother, the Duke of York, became King George VI after his father. He was to be just as good a leader as his father was. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up. it would help the channel to grow even more. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you.